So the strength of the book has been created and nurtured by our authors who emanate from a range of professional practice backgrounds and who have shared their expertise from the disciplines of education, health and social care. We're really pleased so many contributors and we really hope that you enjoy the seminar. Our seminar, as you will know from the agenda, is divided into 4 sections. So I'm just going to introduce the first section. And the discussion point is around what is childhood wellbeing and resilience. So we have 3 presentations within this section. The first is from Alison Lewis, who unfortunately is unable to be here today, but she's provided a video for us, which is entitled Understanding the Concept of Child Wellbeing, Dimensions, Domains and Discourses.
I want to say, first of all, thank you very much to you and Zita again for the invitation to contribute to the book. And it's always a nice exercise to contribute to an edited collection such as this. And thank you also to my co-authors, who are Emma Ormerod, who runs a community theatre company called the Lighthouse Theatre Company, and also Catherine Eccleston, who's Emeritus Professor at the University of Sheffield. Fortunately, Catherine couldn't join us today, but I think Emma's should be in the audience, assuming she hasn't had any technical problems. And I'm based at the University of Wolverhampton in education with Zita. I've been working in the area of resilience for quite some time, actually. I first started, I wasn't planning on going on about this, but thinking about it, I first started with Catherine about probably 10 years ago now, on a project about resilience at the University of Birmingham, sort of thinking about all the conceptual side of things. And we looked at an intervention called Paths Promoting Alternative Thinking Strategies as part of that project. So I sort of returned to it with this book chapter in a way. So yes, our chapter was called The Concept of Resilience and Implications for Interventions in Schools. So I think the aim really was to provide a bit of sort of contextual background. If I can get back into the Teams meeting here, because all I've got is 2 versions, that's it. A bit of contextual background on resilience and policy terms, and a critique of the discourse of resilience in policy, and also in terms of how that has then sort of translated into interventions that have been used in schools in recent years, both in this country and abroad. Just to start, yes, as part of wider interest in well-being, another concept there, which, and it's a bit unfortunate actually we haven't had Alison's presentation, because I think that would have been useful for that sort of conceptual contextualization. But anyway, it's been part of a wider interest in well-being, and amidst growing concerns about children and young people's mental health, as you mentioned, Sarah, the concept of resilience has become popular in many policy and practitioner discourses and across diverse policy areas, including education and mental health, which is the area I've worked in previously. In Emma's area is mental health. And part of that picture has been promotion of a range of interventions that purport to build resilience in schools, that have been used both in the UK and other countries. So, as I say, the point of our chapter was to provide some context to the policy, some policy background on wellbeing and the wellbeing and resilience agenda, and outline some points of critique. So if I just start with, let me just, it's a bit complicated now, isn't it? If I just go to my second slide, policy context.
Well done, we've got that, thank you.
On my other machine, yes. So as we've just said, there's been an increasing educational focus on resilience. Has been part of a wider agenda to promote young people's social and emotional well-being, in part a response to not only that sort of social justice concerns about reports of high levels of mental health problem in children and young people, but also linking this to poor educational outcomes. In our article, we do also cite an important article by the sociologist of mental health, Joan Busfield, who critiques actually that whole kind of point about mental illness sort of rising. So I think, in recent years in Britain, societies like Britain. So I think it's important to keep a kind of critical sort of eye on that as well, because it's been very much sort of fueled, hasn't it, by the media and, reports by children's charities, which obviously got an advocacy function. But anyway, it's important to sort of critique that point as well, I think. In our article, we also make a point about the fluctuating discourses in this area, how since the late 90s, English policy and academic discourses in the area of children's wellbeing have fluctuated between social and emotional learning, which was popular in the New Labour days with SEAL and so on, emotional wellbeing, character, which has been sort of popular recently as well, and in the past 5 years, mental health, which I think has come in particularly since the new SEND Code of Practice in 2015. But obviously we've also had the Green Paper, as you mentioned, Sarah, which has used the discourse of mental health and mental health problems as applied to sort of educational contexts. And policy discourses in the last decade have privileged resilience as a key trait or attribute in character education, with this considered a way of addressing social disadvantage and social problems. And in this shifting discursive and practice terrain, notions of resilience building are invariably accompanied by concerns about psycho-emotional vulnerability, which is an area where Catherine's critical theoretical work has focused quite a lot. Just moving on to the next slide. The development of ideas about resilience in educational settings parallels its rise in mental health policy contexts as well, where it has featured along the allied and extensively critiqued concept of recovery. We've seen escalating public media and political concerns about children and young people's mental health, of course, most recently in the context of the pandemic, of course, where there have been concerns about isolation, and one of the groups of particular concern being young children and young people. And then, of course, the Green Paper on mental health, issued jointly by the Department for Education and Department of Health, which features ideas about schools needing to build resilience for pupils as part of their work to support social mobility. And among other things, that proposed new mental health support teams for schools. And so we've seen new courses for these new roles, which are called education mental health practitioners around the country, which this year. But there've been quite a lot of criticism of that policy initiative, both in terms of what it has and hasn't done, and also in terms of the kind of whole idea of the sort of, responses being located in responses to perceived heightened levels of need in relation to children and young people's mental health being sort of located in educational settings. So we can always return to that if people are interested in discussing the Green Paper and, how that's been debated and critiqued as well, and the implications of it. So it's probably quite good that I've included this bit here, as we haven't had Alison's talk on defining resilience. As we could sort of we could go on all day about this, couldn't we? I mean, it's quite complex, really. But I quite like this definition. I mean, generally speaking, it's in recent years in academic circles, resilience has been understood as a process involving positive adaptation in the face of adversity. So I think, within sort of academic research anyway, we've seen these kind of phases of resilience research, really. And I think now in recent years, it's kind of accepted that we're really looking at a kind of a process model as opposed to, more of a sort of attribute model. This quote is quite nice: resilience, process of negotiating, managing and adapting to significant sources of stress or trauma. Assets and resources within the individual, their life and environment facilitate this capacity for adaptation and bouncing back in the face of adversity, and across the life course the experience of resilience will vary. So, as I say, with a process rather than a static concept or individual characteristic, psychological attribute or trait, there's a transactional model there, in the sense of it involving transactions between the individual and their environment, and the idea of resilience sort of residing, as it were, within that transactional space, rather than being a property of individuals. And this kind of multi-level sort of thinking often going on, and resilience research often within what's termed a social ecological framework, which has been exemplified in the work of Michael Unger in North America. So in that framework, resilience is generated within and through children's interactions with multiple reciprocating systems, such as schools and families. And resilience is fluid, context dependent, socially situated, and influenced by diverse environmental factors, which I think is an important point there, kind of politically, really, to sort of understand resilience as a situated phenomenon. So resilience work often speaks about protective factors, risk and protective factors. So risks are these sort of areas of adversity in often children and young people's lives, because research in this area has focused quite a lot on children and young people, although obviously work on resilience sort of extends out from that much more widely. But protective factors are supportive aspects of children's lives that help them cope and achieve good outcomes despite adversity. These protective factors operate at multiple interacting levels. So, for example, the individual, which could be internal factors such as social and intellectual skills and orientations, the immediate environment such as the family, and the wider environment extending to external institutions such as a school and community, and then on from there to kind of national social institutions for education, health and welfare. But important to remember that the idea there is a kind of transactional model. So obviously any sort of internal factors, as it were, would be generated by the environment. So I'll put this point in, I think it's quite important. So the definitions involve an input perspective in the sense of exposure to adversity or risk, and an outcome perspective that considers whether coping mechanisms lead to outcomes within or above the expected range. And such outcomes may include educational achievement, social competence, and social behavioural adjustment. Positive adaptation is defined in relation to demonstration of these, or by the absence of emotional or behavioural maladjustment. And then sometimes longer term educational, occupational health, including mental health or social relationship outcomes, are also considered. If an individual or group achieves positive outcomes despite adversity, resilience is inferred. So that's quite important there, isn't it, in research terms, that resilience as a phenomenon or construct is often kind of inferred rather than directly measured in research. Although, of course, now we actually have, there are quite a lot of sort of resilience measures that get used as well. So it's often a sort of an inferred idea from the fact that people are coping well despite the adversities they've experienced. Now, if I just move on. This was the main sort of part of our article, with evaluation of resilience in policy and professional discourses and research. So we can situate work in this area within what have been sort of called recently, perhaps in about become particularly popular, perhaps in about the last 10 years, strengths-based or assets-based approaches to research, which value individuals and communities and offer an ostensibly positive way forward. So the idea there is to kind of move away from a sort of deficit approach and avoid a sort of pathologizing approach as well. And so what's often talked about there is in public health terms, salutogenic approaches as opposed to pathogenic approaches, highlighting the strengths within individuals and communities. And that can be helpful as well in highlighting the situated nature of resilience and the importance of relationships. And the concept may be considered helpful at a personal level. One thinks about one's sort of personal resilience, and in the mental health survivor movement, it has sometimes been considered more helpful than the idea of recovery in pointing to people's strengths and social factors, the idea of process and fluidity being involved and so on, arguably sort of allows more sort of emancipatory approach. And obviously it's been seen as helpful as part of a prevention approach in the area of mental health, which I think you mentioned, Sarah, where the idea is to avoid longer term, more serious problems, and also to help address mental health inequalities across areas such as gender and social class. And identifying risk factors can be a basis for targeted work and associated resource allocation. Identifying groups who are particularly disadvantaged or vulnerable could be argued then provides a basis to further social justice. But what we argue in our article is that within the wider neoliberal policy context and ideology, which has grown since the 1980s to dominate policy perspectives in Western countries, some points of critique should be noted, and in terms of the ideological effects of the discourse of resilience. And so we've sort of just highlighted in our article some of the key ones which have been discussed really in research academic work in recent years, as I say, sort of situating the discourse within that wider policy context. One of the main points that often gets discussed is this about, although in academic research we like to stress the situated nature of resilience and a kind of contextual approach, the problem often is then that within sort of real world interactions and also sometimes in policy discourse, there you end up with this continuing individualistic nature of the discourse, which then turns social problems into individual ones. And then sort of linked to that, people often speak about the problem then becomes this kind of responsibilizing of individuals for the problems they're experiencing, which is often discussed in relation to neoliberal thinking in general. Secondly, that there's a kind of a moralizing embedded in requiring people to demonstrate resilience as a matter of personal responsibility, as I mentioned there. And that obviously, again, especially when resilience is mistaken as a personal trait rather than a process. So there has been some discussion about the problem of burdening individual children and young people with the weight of social problems by encouraging them to internalise risk and responsibility as part of resilience thinking, and the ongoing problem of potentially blaming the victim not only for the problems they're experiencing but also for not being resilient. And we've had some interesting discussions in our department about that, you know, about the sort of whole issue of, if you start talking to young people about resilience and so on, does that then sort of, you know, what does that then do to their subjectivity if you're then drawing attention to, you know, problems in their lives and sort of in a sense responsibilizing them for dealing with what are actually social structurally created problems? Does that, you know, does it have the potential unintended consequence of sort of raising fears or anxieties? So thirdly, the point about underpinning value judgments and assumptions. A resilience perspective is often predicated on pre-existing understanding of risk and positive outcomes or adaptation, which involve value judgments and assumptions. And we say in our article that, yes, that's important to counteract moral relativism arising from sensitivity about defining what are desirable or undesirable conditions, behaviours or practices affecting children. However, in judging what constitutes risk or adversity, there are dangers of socially pathologising the lives of children and young people, for example, as disadvantaged or lacking in certain respects. Indeed, another point here, as it's relating to the point about deficit or assets approach, is some authors have pointed out that instead of an assets or strengths-based model in which children are viewed in terms of existing capabilities and the structural inequalities that limit choices and possibilities, resilience perspectives are often driven by notions of risk, vulnerability and dysfunction and belie a persistent deficit model. And an article by Harper and Ewan, David Harper and Ewan Speed, they point out that resilience thinking relies on identifying problems and deficiencies in people's lives that give rise to the need for resilience, and that resilience is conceptually dependent on a notion of deficit, in that talk of positives and strengths requires the existence of negatives and weaknesses for these concepts to make sense. So there's a couple of points in there. I suppose one is the sort of point about who's defining sort of resilience and risk and what's a positive outcome and so on. Which again, we've had some discussion about that as part of the Head Start evaluation that we've conducted recently, and part of the idea there was to actually look at young people's understandings of that rather than sort of imposing what's a positive outcome or whatever. But the other one is this kind of critique of it actually being a strengths-based approach in a way. Then the point about highly normative nature of the discourse, that it operates within a moral framework of what constitutes being mentally healthy or well adjusted, with this being the only valued state. In the context of emotional distress, the resourcefulness and creativity of certain behaviours for dealing with unlivable situations may be overlooked or pathologized as symptoms of mental illness. There may also be a failure to realise that successful outcomes could come from an ostensibly maladaptive or resistant behaviour, and from a refusal to conform to or accept existing social arrangements and expectations. And that's been discussed as resistant resilience associated with challenging status quo. So there have been sort of critiques about it just being really sort of pro-socialisation to the norm of schooling. And
2 minutes, Lydia.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yes. Yes, that it's a kind of a fitting in sort of a discourse, and a kind of social controlling discourse, really. And that I'll come on to that in a moment. Okay, I'll skip over those slides. The point was to do with it being sort of to do with kind of behaviour management as much as anything else. There's a risk of the discourse feeding into processes of social and mental pathologisation and labelling in education and policy practice contexts, in that it interacts with that of mental health and illness in recent policy documents. And yeah, okay, I'd skip over that. So we conclude that section by saying that illuminating the culturally bound moral and political nature of ideas about resilience highlights political struggle and collective action for progressive social change as one way of generating resilience, and indicates that understandings of resilience should encompass agency, opportunities to act on and shape our social worlds, and not just be confined to coping with or adapting to those. So that's a point that I'll just finish in a moment then, Sarah. I just wanted to say that we could debate the pros and cons of framing things in terms of resilience if people wanted to. And then I just had 2 more slides. Those are some points of critique about school-based interventions that aim to build resilience that sort of relate to my previous slide. One is about the relevance to young people's lives. The second one kind of relates to what I've been saying about the need for a more contextual approach. Third point I've already made. The fourth point that relates to Catherine's work as well, about therapeutic governance, about this idea of sort of how therapeutic ideas infuse our daily lives, and there has been some work talking about resilience in that context. And Catherine's work has argued that actually there is an educational problem here, and that we're detracting from kind of subject-based learning, and that's where, you know, it could be a more liberating sort of focus in terms of addressing educational inequalities. And that was my last slide there, which was about alternative educational approaches to wellbeing, which gets quite complex actually, because I mean, I'm not a philosopher of education, but I mean, sorry, if I just get my last sentence up here. While personal and social well-being may be considered an underpinning aim of education from various philosophical standpoints, I think the point is that much rests on one's conception of this phenomenon and whether well-being or resilience are implicit or explicit educational aims, which could be a point of discussion as well. And our final point is that the argument suggests need for caution about endorsing what's become actually a large publicly funded and lucrative commercial market for well-being and resilience interventions, and caution about evaluations of effectiveness that are also carried out in that market. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia.
Oh, are you there, Zita?
I am, yes.
Brilliant. I'll hand over to you then. Thank you, Lydia.
Okay, thank you.
I am so sorry for not being here from the beginning. I've had some technical difficulties. My name's Zita Williams-Brown, and I'm the co-editor with Sarah for this book. Thank you so much, Lydia. I think if it's okay with you, we're going to move to do the next presentations and then do some questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
That's great, thank you. So I'm hoping that we can get the link to work now. So Alison Lewis, who is now an early years policy advisor for the Welsh Government, has provided us with a pre-recorded presentation on understanding childhood wellbeing. So we're going to see if it works. Hopefully no. Michael, are you able to add that, if that's okay?
Give it a go.
Thank you.
You were away, Zita, when I took the liberty of describing us after 5 years of co-editing the book as an old married couple. And I said we were like a comfortable pair of slippers. So you could have introduced yourself just now as the other slipper, really.
The other slipper, oh, I love that. It's going to be so strange not working so much with one another, isn't it, after all these.
Yeah.
Ah, thank you, Michael. This is great.
Is that coming up?
Yes, yeah, we can see it now.
Right, then the question will be, can we hear it as well? So.
Hello everyone, my name is Alison Lewis and I contributed to chapter 1 of this book, and chapter 1 is called Understanding the Concept of Child Wellbeing, Domains, Dimensions and Discourses. Sorry I can't be with you today at the event, but I'm hoping that this short presentation will inspire you to want to read the book and be interested in reading chapter 1. I just want to give you some background to how this chapter came about for me. So it's the work and the result of my PhD, which I completed between 2012 and 2015. It was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and I studied at Cardiff University. So the PhD, what I did with the PhD was set out to explore how wellbeing was understood by practitioners who work with young children and how it was operationalised in the curriculum. I did that by examining the implementation of the foundation phase, which is the early years curriculum for 3 to 7-year-olds in Wales. What I try to do with the chapter is explore this complex nature of wellbeing, and I spent a long time grappling with the concept and working out what it is. And I use the chapter to try and provide some clarity about the concept. I hope it broadens and extends people's understanding of the concept, and I structure it in a way which I think helps to provide clarity by using and describing and explaining domains, dimensions and discourses of wellbeing. What I also do in the chapter is I explore a valid claim by Raghaven and Alexandrova, who state that perhaps a theory of child wellbeing doesn't currently exist because of the long-standing discourses, such as those written within philosophy, were not originally written with children in mind. So it's a valid claim, and I explore whether what we currently know about theories of wellbeing, whether there's a link or a connection with early childhood development and what we know about that. And I also encourage the reader to really think about whether a theory of child wellbeing is needed, and I leave that up to the reader to decide. So I first talk about in the chapter is the challenge, if you like, or the messiness of trying to define well-being. So I'm not using the chapter to, I don't set out a specific definition of well-being. That's not my intention with the chapter. But I explain and try and describe that defining well-being is difficult and challenging. And one of the reasons for that is that there are many different interpretations and they exist within different disciplines. Often well-being is conflated with other concepts. Some people use it synonymously with happiness and welfare or quality of life and mental health and so on. And in terms of the semantic kind of challenge, it is, it is a noun, but as many of us will know, there are different types of nouns. So is it, when we're defining it, is it understood as a common noun, an abstract noun, a concrete noun, a collective noun? And this makes it somewhat challenging to define. If understood as a socially constructed concept, then those would argue that it can't have a fixed meaning, and others say it can have a fixed meaning. And it's not for me to say whether it does or it doesn't. For me, I use the chapter to highlight some of the challenges and the discussions around well-being. And because there are different understandings, many different interpretations, this makes it very challenging to measure and enact in practice. So in terms of providing clarity about well-being, start off by discussing different domains of well-being, or another way of understanding this is by describing well-being by having types of well-being. So many different domains exist, and there's not always an agreement with children and young people what domains should be focused on, which ones are privileged, etc. So by domains, I mean something like emotional well-being, social well-being, physical well-being, economic well-being, holistic well-being, and there's many out there that you would read about. In terms of children and young people, emotional and physical well-being and mental health and well-being are often associated with children and young people, and there's a lot of agreement around that. But other domains might, you might see other domains being described. So in terms of education-related policy, the emotional well-being, so this is the result of my work, and it might be different for other people, but emotional well-being is often privileged. And it's associated with education-related policy, mainly because of the links with learning. That's one of the main reasons why we see more of emotional well-being linked to education. Some of my work looked at obviously exploring Welsh policy, and I've looked at other, as I'm familiar with some of the policies in England, social well-being from my work can be overlooked. And by social well-being, I'm talking about a whole range of social skills here, but particularly pro-social behaviour and positive development. And for me, if social well-being is being overlooked and it's not always explicit in policy, like emotional well-being is, then this raises a question about, does this indicate, particularly because of social well-being being associated with positive development and pro-social behaviour, does this indicate a negative view towards children and young people, where their contributions are not genuinely valued? So if emotional well-being is often associated with education-related policy, then does this indicate then there's more of a vulnerable negative deficit view towards children? These are questions for us to consider. What I do with the chapter is I identify various policies from around the UK, and that's important because often England is dominated with policies in books. So I list some policies from around the UK, and then I encourage the reader then to go and look at them and see what domains are evident in these policies, and perhaps try and understand why they might be evident. What reasons are they there? So moving on from domains, I then talk about dimensions of well-being. And there are two dimensions of well-being, and you can see here the subjective and the objective. And I worked really hard to try and find an image, because I'm mindful that some of my other slides are text-based heavy. So what I try and do in the chapter is to describe those two dimensions and help the reader understand that the subjective dimension, if you like, might be easier to understand as being a very abstract noun. And really, maybe you can't, maybe it's difficult to define. It's very subjective to each person. It's not very easy to describe it. And that particular piece of art there is actually called Earthly Wellbeing, which I thought was very fitting for the chapter and this presentation. And then we've got, if you like, the opposite, an objective dimension. So if you like, more concrete, something that perhaps you can hear or see, or something that is easier to measure. And what I include in the book is that I identify that both these dimensions have similarities and differences. And what I noticed from my reading is that the dimensions, the differences are often talked about. But for me, both of those dimensions are complex. Both of them fluctuate and change, and both are based on people's values. So in terms of the objective dimension, lots of maybe reports on children's well-being are describing children's well-being, but often proxy indicators are used. So it could be school attendance, it could be achievement scores, it could be infant mortality rates. So a lot of hardcore statistics would be identified, and indicators would be used to report on children's well-being, but not necessarily from the children and young people themselves, which is where the subjective dimension is important. So for me, I try and argue, if you like, in the chapter that both dimensions are just as important as each other. And I object to the objective dimension being privileged and perhaps being overused then. What we notice is that when the subjective dimension of children's well-being is included or talked about, it's very often for children aged 8 years of age and above. Very little reports document the young children's subjective well-being under the age of 8, and that's something that I'm keen to take forward with my work. But moving on to, if you like, the discussion of discourses and what are they, I've just identified some of them that I explain in the chapter. And what I conclude with that is that in terms of helping us gain a clearer picture of well-being, particularly when it's often described, we know it's complex, we know it's a complex concept, but often when it's described as ambiguous and vague, then perhaps adopting more than one discourse would be helpful for us in gaining a clearer picture and trying to understand aspects of these different discourses. I think is quite important. And you'll notice there that it was from around about there's an arrow between psychology and economics. From around about the 1960s, psychologists started becoming interested in measuring well-being. And in terms of GDP, which is gross domestic product, in terms of the success of a particular society or economy, GDP was often being used, and you could say used inappropriately, to measure people's well-being. So what economists did they look to the discipline of psychology to draw upon people's subjective well-being as a way of reporting well-being rather than relying on the GDP measure. In terms of child well-being discourses then, there are two particular writers who've published papers. So Mergic and Humblett, they had explored child well-being discourses with their paper. And I include a table in the chapter with these 5 discourses. And what they identify is that some discourses are underrepresented. You can see that on the left-hand side, and some are more dominant. And what happens is that when a particular perspective is more dominant, then it is measured in a particular way or enacted in a particular way. And what I try and or highlight in the chapter is that the new sociology of childhood discipline can really help us shift and have more of a balance between these two, if you like, contrasting aspects of discourses. So the one discourse that I've highlighted there is this positive development, where we view children as rights holders, agents of change, you know, the capable child, versus a very negative deficit perspective where we see children as vulnerable, needy, etc. So the new sociology of childhood discipline can really help, I think, in terms of having more of a balance with these aspects. And that's what I'd like to, you know, see happen with the certain child wellbeing discourse, is to have a balance of both rather than one be more dominant over the other. And the other work that I think of Raghaven and Alexandrova, who I think have contributed to the work on child wellbeing discourses, is work that they did where they stated that philosophical discourses of well-being, they just might not straightforwardly extend to children because at the time they weren't written with them in mind. So it's a valid claim, and for the remaining part of the chapter, what I do is explore this claim, and I show in the discussion that many of the leading discourses of well-being, particularly within philosophy and psychology, they do relate to children and young people in some way, particularly when, and this is quite important, when we frame, if you like, our conceptualization of children and young people with a positive development lens, where we view them as competent and able. And so these 2 papers, particularly for me, they contribute to the child wellbeing discourse. But what I challenge the reader to do at the end is consider to what extent whether we need a theory of child wellbeing. And I leave the reader with, you know, pondering over that with the reading that they've taken on board with the chapter. So hopefully that just gives you a very brief overview of what the chapter really does and aims to achieve, and really provides you with an insight into the concept of well-being in a little bit more detail. And thanks very much for listening.
Okay, and thank you to Alison for pre-recording that for us. So to finish off this presentation time slot, we have Sarah Mander, who is going to consider well-being and mental health in the HE student population. I am going to attempt to upload the PowerPoint, so just bear with me for one moment.
Well, good morning again, everybody. I can start you off while Zita's just uploading the presentation. And just to tell you a little bit about why I wrote chapter 3 of the book and focused upon student wellbeing in higher education. It's because of my personal and professional interests in young people's welfare, which is situated within early intervention and preventative work, as I touched on earlier on. In recent years, welfare concerns have increasingly focused upon mental health and well-being, and my aim in writing the chapter was to provide a non-mental health specialist perspective, which might assist higher education students and staff who are seeking to be responsive and helpful to students who might not be thriving. Okay, so I've chosen to share with you some of the key concepts of my chapter, which include the shiny new policy context of mental health provision in higher education, influential factors on students' mental health and well-being, and also the relationship between student voice and well-being, more recently phrased as co-creation strategies. So why did we extend the age range of this book to include higher education students? Essentially, the book would have been incomplete without considering the mental health and well-being of our student population, because universities and education are fundamentally connected to the development of this book. The book's target readership is undergraduate students who study education-related courses within higher education, and our author background and professional context are firmly situated within higher education institutions across the world. All of us routinely come into contact with university students within our professional roles. Students arriving at university who may have experienced poor mental health have also experienced a broken CAMS system, which is likely to have impacted negatively upon their mental health needs. Rather a blanket statement, but do bear with me. During the writing, we were in the midst of the 5-year Future in Mind policy, the Green Paper, which we've mentioned so far this morning, and that set out to promote, protect and improve mental health and wellbeing for the 0 to 25 age range, not just the 0 to 18 age range. Some major educational initiatives were launched. Universities UK launched the new framework in 2017, this hashtag Step Change framework, to align with the school's Green Paper, transforming children and young people's mental health provision. Step Change bridges the gap for the 19 to 25-year-old age range, consistent with the extended age range of Special Educational Needs and Disability Code of Practice, the SENDCOP, which was updated in 2015. It also delivers on the legislative duty of the Equality Act in 2010, where students might self-classify as disabled due to mental health conditions. Crucially, from this year, from 2020, hashtag Step Change is rebranded, now identified as Universities UK Mental Health University Strategic Framework. It's the first university mental health charter launched through Student Minds, and it's a really good practice model for improving wellbeing and mental health outcomes in universities. So some obvious statements here with some not so obvious links. We appreciate that higher education attainment is negatively affected by stress, anxiety, depression, grief, sleeping difficulties, and relationship problems. Some of the ways that students experience these issues has a negative impact on their sense of identity and belonging to their university. Historically, in order to retain students who are experiencing poor mental health, universities have provided specialist support, for example, counselling services, or possibly signposting to external organisations. Hashtag Step Change advocated a shift in direction, suggesting that while specialist support will still be appropriate and available for students who need it, there should be a universal strategy which has the potential to improve retention and academic success by improving well-being. The 8 strands on the right-hand side that you see of the step agenda are outlined here. A whole university approach is required, which intends to improve mental health and well-being for both staff and students. In doing so, the stigma associated with mental health can be reduced, which can only be a positive outcome. The spectrum of good well-being to poor mental health for students should be provided for, and accurate current data must inform this provision, from preventative support to early intervention, and as I've already mentioned, specialist support for students experiencing significantly poor mental health. Key points of transition require additional focus, with partnerships developed to ensure smooth transition, for example, from school or further education into university. Effective information sharing is key to success. Effective evaluation of data enables universities to map existing services and identify gaps in provision. Recent changes to some university admissions procedures request students' consent to sharing information relating to their mental health and well-being with parents and carers. It's important to note that the GDPR regulations from 2018 restricts disclosure of this nature without consent. The Higher Education Policy Institute Student Academic Survey in 2019 specifically researched whether students felt it might be appropriate to share personal data relating to their mental health with parents, particularly when extreme circumstances such as a failed suicide attempt had been made. Around 82% of students were in agreement that sharing of such personal data would be expected and/or encouraged, although this was marginally less welcomed by the more independent over 26 age range. Who we often see at the Open University, obviously. It's the first time a research question of this nature was included within the annual survey, and it is thankfully becoming standard practice within many HE institutions. You'll be familiar with Arnstein's model of participation, which I'm using as a theoretical starting point to demonstrate the specific area of potential growth in student voice, which the University Mental Health Charter recognises as essential to improve student well-being. Regardless of our and others' critique of Arnstein's model, we recognise education is hierarchical in nature, which results in this model being fit for purpose in relation to student voice discussions. We would probably agree that within higher education, we work hard and are successful in achieving up to a partnership approach, level 6, and are willing to delegate power in some areas. We should also acknowledge that each time we, for example, invite students to attend our meetings, share their experiences or research activities, we retain the majority of the power because they are only in attendance at our request. Their participation is not truly in their control, even though and in spite of us believing we have given away control. And this results in inequitable practice. The highest levels of participation are the hardest to achieve, but bear the most fruit in respect of student experience and student success. They cultivate buy-in from students, which lower levels of participation, such as surveys, struggle to achieve. In chapter 4 of the book, Helen Linden explains that research with children and young people informs us that a participatory approach to educational relationships produces the best outcomes. It's the same for higher education students and might be considered more meaningful because study at university is voluntary rather than statutory like school. And we engage in adult-to-adult relationships where power should be more evenly distributed. In respect of well-being, the university's UK strategy is clear that co-creation opportunities should be available through a whole university approach if student well-being is to improve. However, the relinquishing of power, as we well know, can be uncomfortable and impractical. It's best managed as a, in celebrity speak, conscious uncoupling of the old to introduce the new. It challenges our existing ingrained ways of working, the cultural climate which informs our identity as individuals and an organisation, and requires investment. Investment is required by universities to manage this necessary change. Having identified an opportunity, we need to secure engagement, raise awareness, articulate what changes need to take place, and ultimately create behaviour changes in the strength and meaning of student voice in every aspect of our business to ensure it's integral rather than bolt-on. And this has the potential to improve participation in activities considered lower level, such as the National Student Survey, which holds such weight within higher education rankings. So I've popped here some further reading for you. As I mentioned in the chat box, we will distribute the slides a little bit later on for you after the event. But I've also got a little bit of a takeaway message. And I'm wondering really whether you could reflect on your activities you've undertaken in the past week, however broad or narrow those might be, and assess really which has the potential to encompass the strands of the step change framework, and question in terms of our reflective practice, is this enough to achieve the highest levels of participation, to achieve that co-creation which we're aspiring to, and if not, what more can be done? So you will get some references at the end of the slides, but that's it from me. Thank you ever so much for listening, and I really hope that the techie bit has worked okay.
Thank you, Sarah. It didn't work completely because the PowerPoint slide wouldn't move forwards, but I've tried to do it on your behalf. So we saw the introduction slide for quite a bit of time, and then I've kind of moved.
Bless you.
So we've seen them all, but not necessarily at the same time you were talking about it. So I do apologise about that. I don't know why I moved forward.
It's how it is today, isn't it? Thank you very much for helping, Zita.
Yeah, we're having one of those days, aren't we, with the technology? So can I ask, please, that we'll just do a few minutes for questions for those three presentations. So if you have any questions, do you want to come on to turn your camera on and turn your audio on and ask a question to any of the presenters? Or you could add something to the chat. Do you want to have a think about that for one moment? And I've got one from Carl here that was posted earlier. So if I start you off with that, Sarah and Lydia, if that's okay, and then anybody else, please do feel free to turn your camera on and your audio on and ask your question or comment. So it says, due to the different views on resilience, how can one measure it in a good way? Both the individual and environmental protective factors could vary so much from individual to individual. The cognitive could be really present at one person, or the environment has everything to say to another. Lydia or Sarah?
I did put a sort of half of a response on there. Well, yeah, the point I was making was about, obviously, you know, the cognitive would be environmentally influenced. So this is why often models have this multi-level approach, and you know, there's the need to recognise the interactive nature of all these things, and so it's a very complex picture. But the problem often becomes that everything, you know, is kind of reduced down to the individual, isn't it? Then that there's an overly, as I was saying in my presentation, sort of actor-centred sort of approach, but kind of, I don't know, I suppose you'd call it kind of psychological reductionism as well, isn't there? So this is the whole problem with using a measure, in a way, that it does become, it also sort of personalises resilience as a concept. So personally, I wouldn't use a measure at all, because I think it's too problematic in that way. Sorry, what was the other part of the question? I sort of lost it a bit there, but yeah. Yeah, there's a conceptualization. I mean, you know, in sort of qualitative work, you can still use the construct and sort of conceptualize things in terms of resilience. But I suppose it's another question relating to research paradigms and ethics and politics and everything else as to whether you would want to sort of try to measure it. That also relates to the issue of sort of construct validity, as well as all these kind of political problems, but with the idea of brought back to it being a sort of personal trait, if, or attribute or characteristic, if you're not careful, which I suppose it kind of does in a way if you're sort of administering an individual measure. I don't know what other people think about that.
Carl, do you want to ask anything further on that?
I guess I would like to ask what measures are seen as acceptable and ethical valid measures for resilience.
Well, there are quite a few around which in sort of research terms are considered to be, you know, valid in the sense of they've been validated. There's the Connor-Davidson scale is very widely used, and there's also a measure of resilience, particularly for children and young people, which I can't remember the name of that one now, but I think it was developed by Michael Unger's team in Canada, and I can look that one up. You know, so there are some that are sort of directed towards certain research populations as well. The Connor-Davidson one has got these different resilience domains, and the different sort of items relate, you know, then there's the idea that they sort of cluster into these different factors that relate to different resilience domains. There are others out there, but it depends on what you sort of think is acceptable, obviously, in your own projects, and what, yeah, to what degree these things, how do they conceptualize resilience? To what degree are they sort of viewing it in terms of people's sort of social worlds as opposed to their personal attributes? I suppose, yeah. I'll look up that one I mentioned that's particularly for children and young people.
Thank you.
It's the CYRM measure. I just put it in the chat. Unger's measure.
Ah, thank you, Michael.
We have another question here for you, Lydia, before we move on to the next presentation time slot. It says, interesting definition and understanding of resilience. I'm curious to know if there is any specific work on resilience which focuses on marginalised girls, boys in the global south.
Yeah, I did answer that one. I'm not aware of any, but I expect there is, because it is such a large body of research now, isn't it?
No, that's great. Thanks, Lydia. And if anybody has any extra questions or comments, please do add them to the chat, and all of the speakers will be looking at it throughout the course of today, so we can keep on answering questions as well as in the question time for each speaker.
Zita, can I just add in? I'm sorry about this. My chat is not working for some reason. It's just completely blanked over. So I'll go out and come back in a minute. But following Lydia's response to Carl, I think one of the emergent themes that arose while we were finalising the book, and will obviously be at the forefront of everybody's minds today, is the COVID-19 pandemic, and how that influences how children's well-being is measured, not just how they experience well-being as a result of the pandemic. And I just think it's worth raising that and saying it out loud, and making sure that we just have a little think about that for the rest of the day, really.
I would add to that as well that I think we need to be careful of talking about measuring things all the time. Problem, isn't it? Because you know, we want to think about understanding, knowledge generation in relation to whatever I'm doing personally, my own research. So through use of theory and so on. So you know, we often get caught up on these ideas, don't we, about how you can measure these different things, but that isn't necessarily what we're aimed at, is it? We're actually aimed at sort of achieving understanding in the area.
Thanks, Lydia.
I would argue.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.